Yes, the demise of bellweathers. Yeah, we're going to be talking about this in this video as to how several notable bellweathers died. Um, so we're going to be looking at bellweathers in politics in the United States. We're not looking at counties. Looking at, for varying lengths of time, the highest percentages, we have Nevada, Ohio, Florida. Um, in a certain electoral records for a period of time, you have Ohio, New Mexico, Nevada that win if it's 1896 to 2024. In the current system, these are the best states. You have Ohio, Nevada, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania. In terms of smallest deviations in national laws, you have Ohio, New Mexico, Illinois, Missouri, and Delaware. For the mid to late 20th century, you have Delaware, Arizona, North Dakota, Kansas, Washington, Minnesota, Texas, Arkansas, Idaho, Tennessee, New Jersey, Virginia, Illinois, California, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico, Kentucky, Oklahoma, New Hampshire, Colorado, Iowa. But here's the thing. Can we go through all of these? No. No, we cannot. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at states that would deem consistent bellwethers, and then see sort of when they began to lose their bellwether status throughout time, and just see how long this takes because we can't go on forever. Keep in mind, there's a lot of blowout elections, so we are going to be setting this to have popular vote included as well. Just so that we could see, whether or not the election was close or not, and how many close elections they got through. Because in a lot of cases, they may not have had a lot of close elections to contend with at all. First of all, Ohio. Ohio got it wrong in 2020. Despite Biden winning the popular vote by 4%, Ohio voted for Trump by 8%. And it was clear after 2016, when Trump won the state by 8%, it may be losing its bellwether status. It had generally been a right-leaning swing state, even though it had voted consistently. 2004 being the exception when it was the tipping point. It had primarily been a right-leaning swing state. As you can tell, as I shift throughout, even though it's always been right, it's always been a little bit right-leaning. Although it got 1976 correct in a tilt Democratic column. You have all these elections it got right, but 1960 it got wrong by a significant amount too, as Nixon won the state by 6.6% despite Kennedy winning the election. However, as we go to the older elections, you see Ohio getting back on track. It got 1948 right as one of the key critical swing states, but it got 1944 wrong despite FDR winning the popular vote by 7% and winning the Electoral College in a landslide. He still did not win Ohio. However, flipping to the map, a lot of blowouts, Ohio is correct. Gets 1916 right. That's pretty important. Gets a lot of these elections right going back in this time period. 1892 is the fourth most recent election it gets wrong, and that's a close election where Harrison wins Ohio. Now, it also got 1884 wrong as well. It got, so, going back here, Ohio is certainly a bit shakier. We also have, going back to this time frame, the Nevada bellwether. Now, Nevada was wrong in many of these during the populist era. It actually voted for the Republicans in 1888 in their win, so you have that. But in 1892, it voted for the Populist Party pretty strongly, which also got to Idaho, Colorado, Kansas, North Dakota. 1896, the Democrats in their loss win Nevada by 62 points, and in states like Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, it's also the strongest win for Democrats really ever in these states in the populist era. 1900, it still strongly votes for Bryan. Roosevelt does win this in his 1904 landslide, but in 1908, it does go back to Bryan narrowly. Since 1912, though, Nevada has been on track and has only messed up in 2 elections ever since. We have the results in 1976, where it narrowly voted for Republican Ford by 4 points, despite Carter winning, and he won the popular vote by 2. And the other instance of Nevada voting incorrectly was in 2016. Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, but she lost the Electoral College vote. She won Nevada by 2.5 points. However, if you're going by the popular vote, then Nevada messed up in 2000 when Al Gore won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College, but Bush won Nevada by 3.5 points. Had Al Gore won that state, he would have won the election. Got both 2020 and 2024 correct. Florida is another state that really lost its bellwether status. 2020 messed up and voted for Trump by 3.4, and now we're in a state where Florida voted for Trump by 13 points. So it's really shifted hard to the right. I don't know if it's ever going to come back. You could see how Florida was a consistent bellwether. 2000 came down to Florida, and going back, you do have 1992 where Bush won a state by 2 points, despite him losing it by a significant amount in a national election. Prior to that, though, the last time Florida got it wrong before then was 1960, when the Republicans won it by 3 points despite losing a close election. Florida had gotten every single election right going back as far as 1928, but before then, it was a solid South Republican state in 1924 and 1922 major Republican landslides, and Florida in both elections votes around 55 points to the left of the nation at large in both elections. So it cannot be considered a bellwether before then. You have these strong Democratic results. Even though Democrats win in the 2 elections before then, you can't really consider Florida to be a bellwether when it was a solid South Democratic state when, it was voting this far to the left of the nation at large. So it's really only 1928 when the Florida bellwether can be said to have begun. Now, do I agree with it? Not really, because then you have all of these landslides, but at least FDR is winning these elections, even though he's winning them by a lot less than what he's winning them in Florida. And then by 52, Florida corrects itself. New Mexico is also an interesting case. Now, New Mexico got 2024 wrong, voting for Harris by 6, and 2016 wrong, voting for Clinton by 8.2, and it's now considered to be a pretty reliable Democratic state. It also got 2000 wrong, voting for Al Gore by .061, who did win the popular vote, as did Clinton, but lost the Electoral College vote, but at least then it was close. It was winnable for Republicans looking at the 2004 victory in the state, whereas now it seems to be out of reach for the Republican Party. Going back in New Mexico's history, it also messed up in 1976 as Ford won the state by 2.5 points. Before that, though, New Mexico was a strong Republican state, and a Democrat state in line with the nation before that. So it really was in line with what the nation was doing. This is New Mexico. It's actually was pretty accurate. Going back before then. It even got the close election in 1916 right. So from statehood in 1912, New Mexico voted correctly for every single presidential election winner. every single election winner New Mexico voted correctly for until the fateful 1976 election. And that was New Mexico's only miss until 2000. Now, I'm not saying that New Mexico can be considered a bellwether now since it's voted Democrat in 5 elections in a row. And 6 out of the last 7, actually really 8 out of the last 9. I'm not saying that you consider New Mexico to be a Democrat, a bellwether now, but it was definitely a bellwether in the mid to late 20th century before it took a pretty hard shift to the left. Which I think was made apparent in 2008, even though Obama won in a landslide, he only won by 7 points. New Mexico, he won by 15 points, and it just never recovered to go back to its bellwether status again. Another bellwether state during this time, though, that took a hard shift to the left, that's even more notable, is Delaware. Going back, a very far amount of time, Delaware used to not be a bellwether. It got 1888 wrong. 1892, it voted correctly. And then 1896, it voted correctly. And then it votes correctly in many of these elections early on in the 20th century. And then it gets 1916 wrong as it votes for Hughes by 2.4 points despite its loss. Delaware was interesting because despite that, it then is one of the most Democratic states in 1920, seeing as it was a bit close in Harding's landslide. Noting how many of these very tough states he would have needed to have lost the election. This might have been the biggest tipping point in American history. However, more critically than that, Delaware gets 1932 wrong. Hoover wins by 2 points. And he loses in a landslide. Popular vote-wise, it is not even close. It is 18 points in favor of Roosevelt. And the tipping point state is in a safe Democratic column. It is that much of a landslide in 1932. Over half the electoral votes vote for FDR by over 15 percentage points. And then Delaware gets 1948 wrong as well, as Dewey wins, but at least this is close in a close election. Then you go into the 1950s and it's perfect. It gets 1960 right. 1964 was easy. It gets 1968 right as a close election. 1976 it gets right as a close election. Then, continuing on with these results, it gets 1988 right, 1982 right, 1996 right. But the landslide win for Clinton in 1996 was a bit of a sign that Delaware may not be as much of a bellwether state as it was once deemed to be. And indeed, in 2000, Gore won the state by 13.1% in his loss. Now, I guess you can make the argument that he won a popular vote, but the fact that in any case, a close election, and Delaware is this much of a landslide for Gore shows that Delaware is really becoming out of reach. And if you want to go by the popular vote argument, 2004, Kerry wins by 7.6% in the state of Delaware, and he still loses the election. And gets 2008 and 2012 right, but those are easy. 2016, Trump wins. I get that he loses the popular vote. Clinton still wins Delaware by 11.4. And in 2024, Harris loses the popular vote and the Electoral College, and she still wins Delaware by almost 15 points. So that's a signal that Delaware is really out of reach and it can no longer be considered to be a bellwether, since now it's like completely out of reach. At least with John Kerry, there were some signs that showed you it could vote for a Republican if the year was strong enough. Now you have no signs like that. The Missouri bellwether. That's another interesting one. Because Missouri is interesting because politically it was a border state. And much like a lot of the other former slave states, Missouri was a pretty strong Democratic state. Going back into the 1800s, 1868, it voted for Republican, then it was all Democrat until the early 1900s. However, there were signs at least. Missouri was close in 1888. So there were signs that said that Missouri could vote for a Republican, and in Teddy Roosevelt's 1904 landslide, he wins Missouri by 4 points. But since then, Taft wins Missouri by .08 in his convincing win in 1908. And since then, Missouri, while it's been Democratic leaning at the first part of it, has voted correctly, even though there have been a lot of bellwethers. And in 1940, it actually is more Republican than the nation at large, but it still gets it correct, and it's all that matters. Gets the 1948 right, even though it's dicey. Gets 1952 right. It does vote wrong in 1956. It votes for Stevenson by .22, which is actually a little bit more awkward when you realize that Eisenhower won the popular vote by almost 15 points. But then Missouri gets back on track. It's signaled to go back to bellwether status when Kennedy can barely improve on Stevenson's margin, winning it by 0.52%. We have, obviously, a landslide win in 64. It votes for the Republicans in 1968. Democrats win it in 1976, a close election. And, 1988, it's close, but votes for the Democrats, for Republicans, and it votes for Democrats in 1992 and 1996. Republicans win it in 2000. It's close. I get that Democrats won the popular, but Republicans still won. It's 3.3%. 7.2% for Bush in 2004 is a signal that it could be turning more Republican. But what's really stunning is how Obama, who is from neighboring Illinois, lost the state by 0.13 points in 2008. 2008, and Obama still manages to lose this despite winning a popular vote by 8%. And this is really a sign that Missouri is no longer a bellwether, but just for good measure, it voted for Romney by 9 points in the next election, and since then, Trump has won the state by over 15 points in all of his elections. So, at this point, it's clear Missouri is a Republican stronghold that's pretty much out of reach for the Democratic Party. 2008 is when it broke away from its traditional bellwether roots, but 2012 really confirmed it as, seeing as then you had an election where Democrats won and Republicans won Missouri by a lot. I get it was technically within 10%, but still. Okay. A lot of these states that are bellwethers, I'm not going to mention it was in the early just in the early 1900s as an example, unless I deem it notable. But, because you can't go through all of them. But Illinois is another one that, going back in these elections, now, Illinois was a bit of a Republican-leaning state in the 1800s. And granted, so was a nation. So, it's odd. The Whigs win in 1848, and Illinois votes blue. 1844, Illinois votes blue, and the Democrats win. In 1840, though, the Whigs win by a considerable amount, and they can't win in Illinois. 1836, the Democrats win, and they win Illinois. So Illinois was a Democratic state back then, at least. Then in 1856, Democrats win, and they have Illinois. In 1860, Illinois finally votes for the Republicans in a four-way election. In 1864, Democrats also win in Illinois. In 1868, Republicans also won in Illinois, and they won. They won 1868 and 1872 with Illinois. 1876, though, Republicans win narrowly. They do get Illinois, so they win 5 elections in a row. 1880, 6 Republicans win in a row, and they have Illinois. But 1884, Democrats finally win. Blaine still wins Illinois by 4 points. 1888, Republicans win, and they have Illinois. 1892, Democrats win, and Cleveland flips Illinois back into the Democratic column. So 1884 looks like it was the last miss, and it was. And it was correct for a while before 1884 as well, but Republicans were dominating. 1900, we see Illinois vote red. Same for 04 and 08. 1912 it goes blue. 1916 it goes back to Republican by 9.2 points as Illinois has now huge political power. This means that the 1888 to 1912 streak is now messed up. It does get back on track with a bunch of landslides that it gets right, but it does get the key election of 1948 right as a determining state, as it was a close win for Truman. And then it gets the 50s right. 60s, another close election that Illinois gets right as a key deciding state for Kennedy. Well, not deciding state for Kennedy, but still, 0.19, that's very close. And then it gets the 1960s right, 1970s right, but it messes up in 1976. It votes Republican. So now 1920 to 1972 is messed up. It gets the next 5 elections right, but then it gets 2000 wrong, as Gore wins by 12. And this is really the signal that Illinois is out of reach, seeing as now it goes by landslide margins for Democrats. So that's the thing. 2000, 2004, 2016, 2024. All these elections, Democrats lose Illinois. So Illinois was probably a big bellwether from 1860 to 1996. You could make the argument for that long a period of time, but now you can't. Now it's a solid Democratic state. Arizona is also a very interesting state to me, so we're going to talk about it. From its inception of statehood in 1912, it got every election right until 1950, through the 1950s. Granted, it was oftentimes more Democratic leaning than the country, and a lot of landslides helped it out. Like, 1920, close. 1924, very close in both landslides. Then you have 1960, and Arizona finally is wrong. But that's the end of its bellwether status, seeing as even in 64, Democrats can't win in Arizona. And it voted Republican in every election since until 1996. It does get 3 in a row because it gets 2004 right, then votes wrong in 2008, so that's the end of a tiny bellwether blip for Arizona. But it could be starting to become more of a bellwether again. Because 2016 it got it right, it voted for Trump. 2020, Biden flips it back. 2024, it's back to voting for Trump. So, since 1996, in 8 elections, it's gotten 6 of them right. Could this be the resurgence of an Arizona bellwether? Because keep in mind, it got 1992 wrong, and 1966 was the only mess up before then. Obviously, you can't really consider it to be a bellwether because it's strong Republican leaning, but could you consider Arizona to go back to being a bellwether state? Time will tell, but it's certainly the swing state now, and it's certainly, has been a bit bellwethery as of now. Nothing can be ruled out. In the 1900s, you had some of these upper Midwest states be perfect bellwethers. You had North Dakota and Kansas that, for North Dakota started in 1896 and Kansas started in 1900. A bunch of landslides helped them out, but like 1916, both close elections, and they got both right as they both voted for Wilson. And these are small states too. Some of these states that are bellwethers are because they literally tip elections in their favor. These did not. But reason why I'm skeptical is because FDR wins the popular by about 10 points in 1940. Wins a popular by 10 points. Electoral College is a 449 to 82 landslide. Both North Dakota and Kansas vote significantly for Wendell Willkie, and even in 1948 they don't flip back. So this is really the indication that they're strong Republican states, completely out of reach for the Democrats, and it was further confirmed when they've only voted, Democratic once since then, and that was in 1964 in Johnson's infamous landslide. Since then, they've always voted for the Republicans, and it hasn't really been that close ever since. You've had maybe a few elections where it's like, okay, maybe they have a chance, but really they've been Republican-dominant states, and this goes back to 1940. That's why I was skeptical to mention them at first, because they were really only bellwethers for a short period of time, and it was really 1940 when it was clear that they were Republican strongholds. Some of the other states I mentioned go back about as far, but they really are bellwethers until the late 20th century. And these states only go to 1936. 1940, they mess up. That's why I'm not going to go through these states. The reason why I'm not going to go through these states is because a lot of these states, you have multiple misses in a short period of time. How can you consider them to be bellwethers? Historically, you also have these bellwethers, but I'm not going back that far. Because we're running out of time. Pennsylvania is interesting because it was a historic bellwether with one miss from 1800 to 1880, and now it's actually the most accurate state, as while it got 2004 wrong, it got the next 5 elections correct. So it's tied with Wisconsin and Michigan for the longest bellwether streak, as they can all go back to 2008. No other state can go back to 2008. And it's also been a historic bellwether. Wisconsin, also 1860 to 1912, only messes up 1884. Other than that, I mean, not going through the map. Other than that, though, it was a consistent state. Now it's a perfect bellwether. Whereas Indiana and New York, you cannot say the same about those, because those states, one is strongly Republican, even though it voted blue in 2008. One is strongly Democrat, but they've both been, traditional bellwethers. One missed in Indiana from 1852 to 1812, and that's in 1876. New York missed in 1816. That was the only miss from 1880 to 1944. And looking at New York, even though it went wrong in 1948, it did get 1952, 1956, 1960, and 1964 correct before Hubert Humphrey won New York by around 5.5% and is lost in 1968. And it gets even more complicated because 1972, 1976, 1980, and 1984 New York proceeds to get right before its Democratic dominant streak begins in 1988 when Dukakis won by 4 points. So you have one miss from 1880 to 1944. You have 2 misses from 1880 to 1964, and you have 3 misses from 1880 to 1984. Obviously, 1988, it votes Democrat in every election since. I guess you could stretch it further. I don't really feel like doing so. And if we go to the older election side, New York messed up in 1876, but it got 1872 right, but it got 1868 wrong. So, I wouldn't do it that end. But the other end, you could certainly stretch it out for even further than 1844. Like, you genuinely can. And these are the bellwether states in the USA.